Chapter 1. The Casting Out. The storm had been building all afternoon, but no one in Rosewick Manor seemed to notice, except Lady Evelina Harcourt. She had felt it in the heaviness of the air, in the restless stirring of the crows across the moor, in the way the candles sputtered, though there was no draught in the long windows. Evelina had always been sensitive to such things. Her late father used to tease that she could sense the weather with her heart. But this time the gathering storm was not merely of the skies. It mirrored what awaited her inside these walls. Rosewick Manor was not what it had once been. The tapestries were still there, yes, and the chandeliers still dripped with crystal like frozen rain, but the warmth that had filled the house during her father's life had long since died. In its place lingered coldness, a chill that no fire could banish, no laughter could dispel. The great drawing room smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender, but beneath it Evelina detected the sharper, less welcome scent of resentment. The curtains were drawn tight against the coming storm, the fire on the hearth blazing more from show than comfort. Her stepmother stood before her, tall and imperious, every jewel at her throat catching the light like shards of ice. The Dowager Lady Harcourt was a woman admired by many, feared by more. Her beauty had once been famed across the county, though now it was as rigid as a mask, her features sharpened by bitterness and ambition, and that mask was turned full upon Evelina. "You have shamed this family for the last time," the Dowager said, her voice crisp and cold as frost on glass. The words cut like a blade, though Evelina tried to remain still, chin lifted as she had been taught since girlhood. Her gown, a pale blue silk her father had gifted her before his death, clung to her slender frame. She clutched her hands before her to still their trembling. "I have done nothing but honor father's memory," Evelina answered softly, though her heart thundered. "Honor?" The Dowager's lip curled. "Is that what you call your refusal to bow to my wishes? Your insolence in rejecting the suitor I chose for you? Sir Edmund is a wealthy man, respected, willing to take a ruined girl as his bride despite her lack of dowry, and you spurn him with, what was it? 'I will not wed a man I do not love.'" The Dowager's voice mocked Evelina's own words. A few servants lingered at the edges of the room, eyes lowered, but Evelina knew they were listening. Every syllable spoken tonight would be repeated in the servants' quarters, and by morning the whole estate would buzz with the story. "Marriage is not a bargain, stepmother," Evelina whispered. "It is not meant to be a chain. My father would never have forced me." "Do not speak of your father to me." The Dowager's jeweled hand clenched around her fan, snapping it shut with a sound like a whip. "Your father left me with debts, with burdens. I have carried this house on my shoulders while you live in girlish fantasies of love and freedom." Evelina flinched but did not look away. The Dowager took one step closer, her shadow falling over Evelina like a shroud. "You are nothing without this family, Evelina, nothing, and if you will not obey, then you will have no place here." The words hung heavy, as final as a tolling bell. Evelina's throat constricted. "You would cast me out into the night? There is a storm rising. Then let it teach you humility." The Dowager's hand rose, pointing toward the door. "Go, now, and never return." For a heartbeat, silence. Only the wind rattled against the windows, impatient, hungry. Evelina's breath caught. She looked around, hoping, foolishly, that someone, anyone, might intervene, but the servants kept their heads bowed. No one dared defy the dowager. Her legs felt like stone as she moved toward the great oak door. Each step seemed to echo, louder and louder, like a drum beat of doom. At the threshold, she paused, turning back just once. "One day," she said softly, "you will regret this." The dowager's eyes narrowed. "I regret nothing." The footman pulled the door wide, and the storm answered with a howl, sweeping through the hall, extinguishing half the candles. The scent of rain and salt and wildness rushed in, and then Evelina was outside. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a finality that seemed to sever her from her very life. The storm struck her at once, cold rain lashing her face, seeping through her gown until it clung to her skin. The sky above was black as ink, ripped open by forks of lightning that set the moors aglow in fleeting silver light. She staggered forward, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it was already soaked. Her slippers sank into the sodden earth, mud clinging, slowing her steps. Every gust of wind threatened to topple her, pushing her further from Rosewick Manor, from the only home she had ever known. Her heart ached, but her spirit, though battered, did not break. She thought of her father, of his warm laughter, the way he would sweep her into his arms when storms frightened her as a child. He had always told her she was brave, that she carried a fire in her that no cruelty could quench. But tonight she felt small, abandoned, cast out like refuse. Tears mingled with the rain on her cheeks. She whispered to the wind, "Where shall I go? What will become of me?" No answer came, save the crash of thunder and the roar of the sea somewhere beyond the moors. She walked on, driven by desperation more than strength. The countryside stretched before her like a desolate sea of shadows. She had no lantern, no coin, not even a destination, only the storm for company. And then, as lightning blazed across the sky, she saw it. At first it seemed a trick of her weary eyes, a dark shape rising from the cliffs, jagged against the storm-lit heavens. But as the light flashed again, she knew it was no illusion. A castle, its towers pierced the clouds, its walls grim and ancient, perched upon the cliffs, as if defying the very sea below. It stood alone, vast and forbidding. Yet in that moment, it was not terror Evelina felt. It was hope. She drew a ragged breath and turned her faltering steps toward it. The storm seemed determined to stop her, winds screaming louder, rain battering harder, as though the very elements conspired to keep her away. But Evelina pressed on, the thought burning in her mind, "If I can reach those gates, I may yet live." Closer and closer she came, until at last the iron gates loomed before her, tall and spiked, the crest of a blackthorn tree carved in their bars. She pressed both hands against them, her strength nearly spent. "Please," she whispered to no one, "let there be someone inside." And as if in answer, a lantern's glow appeared in the darkness beyond. Chapter 2. The castle on the cliff. The lantern's glow swayed in the storm like a fragile star, bobbing closer with each step until it revealed the tall figure who carried it. The iron gates creaked as the man behind them lifted the lantern high, its flame spilling across his face. Evelina drew in a sharp breath. He was no servant. His bearing was unmistakable, the carriage of a man who commanded rather than obeyed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark cloak whipping in the wind. His hair, black as the storm itself, fell untamed across his brow, and a scar cut sharply across his cheekbone, a pale reminder of battles fought and survived. But it was his eyes that struck Evelina most of all, cold, grey, unyielding, like steel forged in fire. They pinned her in place, leaving her trembling not from the storm but from the weight of his gaze. "Who goes there?" His voice was deep, carrying easily over the storm, threaded with suspicion. Evelina pressed her hands harder against the iron gates, her fingers numb with cold. Her voice shook as she answered, yet desperation lent her strength. I beg your pardon, sir. I seek only shelter for the night. I was cast out. I have nowhere else to go." For a moment the man did not move. The lantern light flickered across the scar on his cheek, across the shadow of his jaw, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You should not be upon these cliffs," he said at last, his tone more measured, though no less severe. "The storm has claimed many lives here." Evelina's lips trembled. "Then allow it not to claim mine." The silence that followed seemed endless. She feared he might turn away, leave her there to the mercy of the winds and the sea below. But then, with a sudden motion, he set the lantern down and pulled open the gates. They groaned in protest, heavy iron grinding against stone, until there was room for her to slip through. "Come," he commanded. Relief nearly brought Evelina to her knees, but she summoned the last of her strength and stumbled forward. The moment she passed the threshold of the gates, the storm seemed to fall away, still fierce, still raging, but muffled, as though the very walls of the castle had swallowed some of its fury. The man retrieved his lantern, his expression unreadable. "Follow me." She obeyed without question. The path wound upward, lined with ancient oaks whose branches thrashed in the gale. Beyond, the castle loomed ever larger, its turrets and battlements dark against the lightning-torn sky. Its windows glowed faintly with torchlight, like watchful eyes in the night. At last they reached the great doors, iron-bound oak, carved with the same blackthorn crest she had seen upon the gates. The man pushed them open, and the storm gave a final howl as Evelina stepped across the threshold into the castle's embrace. Inside, warmth greeted her, warmth and silence. The vast entrance hall stretched before her, lit by torches in iron sconces. The floor was flagstone, worn by centuries of footsteps. The walls hung with faded tapestries depicting hunts, battles, and long-dead ancestors. High above, the ceiling arched into shadow, beams heavy with age. The great doors closed with a booming finality, shutting out the storm. Evelina stood trembling, her soaked gown clinging to her, her breath rising in sharp gasps. The man set down his lantern and removed his cloak, shaking rain from his shoulders. "You are half drowned," he said, his voice quiet now, though still edged with command. "Come nearer the fire." He led her into the great hall, where a hearth, taller than a man, blazed with a roaring fire. Its heat struck Evelina's chilled skin, making her shiver all the more as her body struggled to remember warmth. She sank into the nearest chair, unable to resist, while the man studied her in silence. At length he spoke. "I am Lord Alaric Blackthorn, master of this castle." The name was one Evelina had heard before, whispered among county folk. Blackthorn, a family both feared and respected, its line marked by warriors and lords whose loyalty to crown and land had often come at a terrible price. Rumors abounded of curses, of tragedies that clung to their name. Evelina lowered her eyes, curtsying as best she could in her sodden gown. "My lord, I am Lady Evelina Harcourt. My stepmother has cast me out. I have no coin, no carriage, and nowhere to turn. I beg you, do not send me away." Alaric's eyes lingered on her, unreadable as before. He leaned one arm upon the mantel, the firelight painting harsh lines across his scarred face. "This castle," he said slowly, "is not accustomed to visitors, least of all women who appear at its gates in the middle of a storm." Evelina lifted her chin, though tears threatened to fall. "I did not come by choice, only by desperation. Had I another door to knock upon, I would have done so." He studied her for a long, tense moment. Then, to her astonishment, his voice softened, barely. "You may stay for tonight. But know this, Lady Evelina, Blackthorn is a house of shadows, and its master is no gallant knight. If you step within these walls, you may never be the same again." The warning chilled her more than the storm had, yet still she answered, her voice steady despite her trembling. "Then perhaps, my lord, I am already lost enough to enter." Something flickered in his eyes then, not quite approval, not quite pity, but recognition, as if her words had touched a chord deep within him. Alaric called for a servant, who hurried forward with blankets and a simple gown of wool. Evelina was led to a chamber, its bed draped in velvet curtains, its windows overlooking the roaring sea. As she lay that night, wrapped in warmth at last, the storm still raging beyond the cliffs, Evelina could not sleep. She thought of the scarred lord with his steel-grey eyes. She thought of his warning, and she wondered what fate she had stepped into, here in the castle on the cliff. Chapter 3. The Lonely Lord. Evelina awoke to the sound of gulls. Their cries cut through the thick velvet curtains of the chamber, harsh and wild, pulling her from restless dreams. For a moment she did not remember where she was. The bed beneath her was far too soft for the servant's palate she expected. The air smelled of salt, sea, and wood smoke instead of lavender polish and beeswax, and the hush of the house was unlike Rosewick Manor's busy corridors. Then memory returned. The storm, the gates, the scarred man who had opened them. Lord Alaric Blackthorn. She rose slowly, her limbs heavy from exhaustion. The gown left for her the night before, a plain dress of grey wool, waited neatly folded on the chair. Compared to her ruined silk, it was a poor garment, but she slipped it on with gratitude, its rough warmth far more comforting than the finery she had been forced to abandon. When she drew back the curtains, Evelina gasped aloud. Her chamber overlooked the cliffs themselves, the sea surging in furious waves below. The morning was pale and grey, the storm not gone but lingering, its clouds torn like ragged sails across the horizon. Wind rattled the windows, carrying the spray of the ocean even this far up. It was a view at once terrifying and magnificent. The castle itself seemed carved out of the very rock, its turrets standing against the elements as though daring the storm to unmake them. Evelina could not help but wonder, how many centuries had Blackthorn stood here, defiant? How many storms had it seen and survived? A knock startled her. A maid entered with a tray of bread, cheese, and broth, bowing quickly before retreating without a word. Evelina ate sparingly, her thoughts more restless than her hunger. It was late in the morning when she finally dared to wander. The corridors of Blackthorn Castle were long and dim, lined with portraits of stern men and solemn women whose eyes seemed to follow her. She trailed her fingers along the cold, Stone walls, each step echoing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crash of waves. At last she found her way to the great hall, where she had first seen the fire. There, seated alone at the long table, was Lord Alaric. He did not look up immediately when she entered, though she felt he had known she was coming. He sat at the head of the table, a goblet before him, a plate scarcely touched. His posture was straight, commanding, though there was a weariness about his shoulders, as if he bore a weight invisible to all but himself. "You slept," he said finally, his voice quiet but resonant. "Yes, my lord, I am grateful." Evelina curtsied, though the plain wool made her feel less a lady than ever. His grey eyes lifted to her at last. They studied her not as a man might study a woman, but as one might study a riddle, cautious and intent. "You are not accustomed to such garments," he observed. "I am not accustomed to many things now," Evelina admitted, "but I shall learn." A flicker of something passed across his expression, gone too quickly to name. He gestured toward the chair at his right. "Sit," she obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. The servants moved quietly about the hall, never lingering long. Evelina noticed how they avoided their master's gaze, how they seemed to move like shadows around him. Alaric broke the silence. "You left Rosewick under unhappy circumstances." The reminder tightened her throat. "My stepmother, she has little fondness for me. With my father gone, I became more burden than daughter in her eyes." Alaric nodded once, as if this did not surprise him. "And you have no other kin?" "None who would claim me." He drank from his goblet, setting it down with deliberate care. His eyes did not soften, yet neither did they condemn. "Then perhaps it is well you came here. Blackthorn keeps its secrets more faithfully than men." Evelina tilted her head. "And yet, my lord, you do not strike me as a man eager for company. Why did you open your gates to me?" The question lingered in the air, bold and dangerous. She half feared he would be angered, but instead he leaned back, regarding her with a strange intensity. "Because you knocked," he said simply. It was not the answer she expected. Alaric rose then, his cloak sweeping behind him. "Come," he commanded. Evelina followed him through the hall, up a grand stair, and into the castle's upper galleries. There he showed her the library, its shelves heavy with tomes, its tables strewn with maps. He showed her the gallery, lined with the armor of his ancestors, breastplates dented from wars long past. He showed her the west wing, but only from the threshold. The doors were locked, dust heavy upon them. "No one enters here," Alaric said, his voice sharp. "Remember that." Evelina nodded, curiosity stirring despite his warning. They returned to the eastern halls, where sunlight pierced high windows, painting the floor in pale gold. Here Alaric paused, his eyes drifting to a portrait. Evelina followed his gaze. It was of a woman, fair, graceful, her smile faint but warm, a likeness painted with care, with love. "Your wife?" Evelina asked gently before she could stop herself. Alaric's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment she feared she had overstepped. "She was betrothed to me," he said at last, his voice low, almost broken. "But she is gone, nothing more." He turned away, his cloak swirling, his shoulders rigid. Evelina stood in silence, her heart aching at the pain in his words. She did not ask further, not then, but the mystery of the lonely lord deepened in her heart. That night, alone in her chamber, Evelina sat by the window as the storm faded into a restless sea. She thought of Alaric, the scar on his face, the steel in his voice, the sorrow in his eyes when he looked upon the portrait. He was a man haunted, a man who lived among shadows, and she was a woman cast out, left adrift, two broken souls beneath one roof. What fate had bound them together, Evelina did not know, but in her heart she felt the stirrings of a story that had only just begun. Chapter 4. Whispers and Shadows. The storm passed by the next day, leaving the air cold and sharp as a blade. The sea below the cliffs had quieted, but it still roared with restless strength, white foam lashing the black rock. Evelina wandered the gardens after breaking her fast, though gardens seemed too generous a word for what she found. The hedges were overgrown, the fountains dry, the flower beds untended for seasons upon seasons. Yet she could see the bones of beauty beneath the neglect, the crumbling stone benches, the marble statues streaked with moss, the wrought iron archways where roses must once have climbed. It was a place forgotten, like its master. As she traced her fingers along the rim of a fountain, she heard footsteps behind her. "Best not wander too far, my lady." Evelina turned. The speaker was a man in his middle years, his shoulders broad though his hair was silvered. He wore the livery of blackthorn, dark green trimmed with black, and his eyes, though kind, were wary. "I mean no harm," Evelina replied softly. "I know." The man bowed. "I am Master Rowan, steward of the household. My lord bade me see to your needs while you remain here. "I thank you, Master Rowan." Rowan's lips pressed into something almost like a smile. "It is not often we receive guests. Some of the servants, they frighten easily with tales and shadows. Do not heed them." "Tales?" Evelina asked, but Rowan only shook his head, as though regretting he had spoken at all. "The sea breeds whispers, my lady. Too much wind in these halls, and men begin to imagine voices in the night. Pay them no mind." He bowed again and left her, his words lingering like fog. Whispers, shadows, imagined voices. Evelina shivered, though the sun had begun to burn through the morning mist. That evening, Evelina was again summoned to dine with Lord Alaric. The great hall glowed with torchlight, though the vastness of the space seemed to swallow the warmth rather than hold it. Evelina wore a gown of dark blue velvet that had been provided for her, a relic of some forgotten trunk, but one that fit as though fate itself had chosen it. Alaric sat at the head of the table as always, his goblet untouched. His scarred face was caught in half light, half shadow, giving him the appearance of a man divided. "You find blackthorn to your liking?" he asked when she entered. "It is different from Rosewick." Evelina sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly. "But I find it has a certain majesty and a certain sorrow." Alaric's grey eyes flickered, a storm rising briefly in their depths. "You see too much? Or perhaps others see too little," she countered gently. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, to her surprise, the faintest curve touched his lips. Not quite a smile, but something close. "You are bold, Lady Evelina." I have little to lose by speaking honestly, she replied. My tongue is all that remains mine. He studied her as though weighing her soul. At last he inclined his head. Then speak freely. What do you wish to know? The question startled her. She hesitated, then glanced toward the portrait she had glimpsed before, the fair woman whose smile lingered in the gallery. Who was she? Evelina asked softly. The lady whose likeness hangs in the east wing. Alaric's hand tightened on his goblet. The hall seemed to grow colder, the torches guttering in unseen draughts. She was to be my wife, he said at last, his voice harsh, as though the words were thorns. Her name was Isabella, but fate had other designs. She never reached the altar. His gaze dropped to the table, shadows carving deeper lines into his face. Evelina waited, but he did not speak further. I am sorry, she whispered. Do not be. Alaric rose abruptly, his cloak sweeping behind him. The dead require no pity. Only the living do. He strode from the hall, leaving her alone with the echo of his footsteps. That night, Evelina could not sleep. The wind moaned through the cracks of the old stones, carrying with it sounds that did not seem entirely of this world. She rose from her bed, wrapped herself in a shawl, and lit a candle. The castle was vast and silent, but not empty. As she wandered the corridor outside her chamber, she thought she heard a faint sound, soft, distant, like a woman's weeping. Evelina froze, her heart racing. She held the candle high, its flame quivering. Is someone there? She whispered. No answer came, only the hollow sigh of the sea. Yet the sound returned, low, mournful, drifting from the direction of the west wing, the forbidden wing. Rowan's warning returned to her. Mind, tales, and shadows, whispers, voices in the night. Her blood chilled. She nearly turned back, but something stronger than fear compelled her forward. She followed the faint sound to the locked doors, their iron handles cold beneath her hand. They would not yield. Still, Evelina pressed her ear to the wood. For a breathless moment, she was certain she heard it. Soft sobbing, a voice broken with sorrow, and then silence. The air seemed to grow heavy, pressing down on her until she stepped back, trembling. She nearly fled. Yet the sudden scrape of boots on stone made her turn. Lord Alaric stood in the corridor. The candlelight flickered across his scar, deepening the shadows in his face. His eyes glinted like steel. What are you doing here? His voice was low, dangerous. Evelina's throat closed. I heard. You heard nothing? His tone cut sharper than a blade. This part of the castle is forbidden. Did I not make that plain? Yes, my lord, Evelina whispered, her hands shaking. Forgive me. For a long, terrible moment he stared at her, as though measuring whether she spoke the truth. At last, he seized the candle from her hand. Go back to your chamber. Now, she obeyed, her heart pounding. Only when the heavy door closed behind her did she allow herself to sink onto the bed, her breath unsteady. What lay beyond those locked doors? What sorrow haunted Blackthorn's halls? Evelina did not know, but she felt the shadows growing closer, their whispers curling at the edges of her soul, and in the depths of her heart she wondered, was the lonely Lord master of his castle, or prisoner of it? Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The storm came back with a vengeance. For 3 weeks, Evelina had walked the halls of Blackthorn, learning its silences, its secrets, its strange companionship. She had dined with Alaric in the echoing hall, listened to Rowan's cautious tales, watched the servants vanish like ghosts whenever their lord appeared. She had breathed the salt air of the cliffs, prayed at the little stone chapel, and traced the shadows of the locked west wing with her eyes, yet nothing had unsettled her as much as the storm's return. It swept across the coast with howls of wind that shook the shutters. Rain struck the glass like arrows, and thunder rolled so violently the tapestries trembled on their hooks. The sea was a beast, gnashing against the rocks, its roar carrying up into the very marrow of the castle walls. Evelina could not sleep. Something in the storm's fury echoed in her chest, tugging her down to the firelit hall where Alaric sat alone. He did not hear her at first. His gaze was lost in the flames, his goblet untouched. Shadows clung to his scarred face, rendering him half a wraith. The firelight played upon the hard lines of his jaw, the faint silver threading his dark hair. He was a figure carved from grief and solitude. "My lord," Evelina said softly. His head turned, and for a moment she thought he would send her away, but instead he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit," she obeyed. The silence between them stretched, heavy, broken only by the storm's rage. Evelina folded her hands in her lap, watching him. His knuckles whitened around the goblet he still had not touched. At last he spoke. "I was once betrothed." The words hung in the air, startling in their nakedness. Alaric's voice was low, rough, as though torn from a wound long buried. "Lady Isolde of Wexmoor. She was light itself, gentle, kind. She could still a hall with a glance, not from command but from grace. When she smiled, it was as though the sun broke through the grey." He fell silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. Evelina hardly dared breathe. "I was called to war," he continued at last, his jaw tight. "My duty as commander was clear, and I believed, fool that I was, that honor and devotion could coexist. I left her here at Blackthorn, under my family's care, with promises of swift return." His hand trembled on the goblet. His scar seemed to deepen, shadow and light dividing him as surely as grief had divided his life. "But when I returned," his voice cracked, raw as an open wound, "she was gone. They said fever claimed her, that she took ill and faded quickly, as so many did. But I knew better. My enemies had sworn vengeance, and their reach is long. Isolde was no victim of chance. She was taken from me because of my sword, my name, my battles." He slammed the goblet down upon the table. Wine spilled dark as blood across the wood. "This castle has been my prison ever since. I locked its doors. I sent away friends, allies. I keep others at a distance, because all I touch turns to ruin." His words broke against the storm's roar, like a confession forced from him by nature itself. Evelina's chest ached. She had seen his silence, his shadows, but never the soul beneath them until now. He had carried this torment alone, convinced himself cursed, unworthy of light. She reached across the table, slowly, cautiously. She let her hand brush his. "Alaric," she whispered. His eyes lifted, startled, not with anger but with something more fragile, vulnerability. "You are not cursed. You are human, a man who loved and who grieves. That does not make you a monster. It makes you mortal, and though the past may haunt you, you are not bound to it forever." The firelight flickered in his eyes, softening their steel. For a moment he seemed younger, not the hardened lord of a broken fortress, but the man who had once believed in love. "Do you truly believe that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Evelina held his gaze, her hand still against his trembling one. Yes, the silence that followed was not empty but full of storm, of sorrow, of something rising unspoken between them. Evelina felt it in her very soul, a bond neither had sought, yet both had found. Alaric leaned back at last, exhaling as though he had borne a weight too heavy for years. You speak as though you see hope where I see only ruin. Because I have known ruin, Evelina said quietly, and still I live, still I hope. If I can, why not you? The faintest of smiles touched his lips, bitter yet real. You are bolder than I imagined, Lady Evelina. Perhaps boldness is all that remains to me. The storm raged outside, shaking the castle as though it too sought entry. But within, by the fire's glow, the walls between them cracked. Evelina saw the man beneath the scar, and Alaric saw the woman beyond her banishment. Two lost souls, finding in each other not answers but understanding. And through the tempest's roar, Evelina felt something awaken, a bond she could no longer deny, a spark of love, fragile yet fierce, burning against the storm. Chapter 6. Betrayal and Flame. The fragile peace Evelina had come to know did not last. Days had passed in a strange calm. Alaric quieter, yet no longer so withdrawn. Evelina bolder in her presence within the castle. They had begun to speak not only of grief, but of small things. The books she favored in the library, the path she had found down to the sea, the sparrows that nested beneath the chapel eaves. These moments were like fragile glass, catching what light they could in a fortress that had known only shadow. But happiness, if such a thing could bloom here, was not left untested. One morning, a carriage appeared on the cliff road, its black wheels slick with mud, its lacquered wood gleaming as though untouched by storm. From it emerged the woman Evelina had hoped never to see again, the Dowager Lady Harcourt. Her stepmother swept through Blackthorn's gates like a tempest of her own making, silks rustling, jewels flashing at her throat. The servants shrank back, as if she carried with her not merely wealth, but venom. She entered the great hall without invitation, her cold eyes raking over the banners, the faded grandeur, and finally Evelina. "So, this is where you hide," the dowager said, her voice smooth and sharp as a blade. "In the arms of a fallen lord, while your family name rots in shame." Evelina rose from her chair, her breath tight, but before she could answer, Alaric stepped forward. His figure filled the space, dark cloak trailing, his scar catching the firelight. "She is under my protection," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of command that had once led men into battle. The dowager laughed, harsh, bitter. "Protection or captivity? Tell me, Evelina, do you not see what he is? A ruined man clinging to the bones of a ruined castle? You are nothing but his latest distraction, and when he tires of you, as he did of the last, he will cast you aside to your own ruin." The words sliced like a knife. Evelina's heart recoiled, but she did not waver. She met her stepmother's gaze, her own voice firm. "My life at Rosewick is over. You made certain of that. Here, at least, I have found truth. I will not return with you." The dowager's smile thinned to ice. "You will regret defying me, Evelina. I promise you that." With a swirl of silk, she turned and swept from the hall, her footsteps echoing like thunder. The sound of carriage wheels soon followed, fading into the distance. But Evelina's unease remained. That night, Blackthorn Castle woke to terror. A scream rang through the corridors, then another. Evelina sprang from her chamber, only to be met with the thick sting of smoke. The west wing was ablaze. The fire spread swiftly, devouring the old wood and tattered draperies. Flames leapt like serpents, curling through the air vents and licking at the tapestries. The corridors filled with acrid smoke, and the servants fled in panic. Evelina pressed her sleeve to her mouth, coughing as she ran toward the cries. But before she realized it, she had stumbled into the forbidden chamber, the one where she had once glimpsed the withered rose on its pedestal. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a violent clang. She spun, clawing at the handle. Locked, the chamber filled with smoke. Fire licked at the cracks, hungry and merciless. Evelina's chest heaved as she fought for breath, her eyes watering. Through the haze she saw it, the rose, its petals withered, its glass dome clouded with dust, yet it stood defiant amidst the ruin, and in that moment understanding pierced her heart. This fire was no accident. Someone had come not only to destroy the castle, but to break Alaric's spirit utterly. The dowager's promise echoed like poison in her ears. "You will regret defying me." Her knees weakened as the smoke thickened. She staggered to the pedestal, clutching it as if the rose could anchor her. Her lungs screamed for air, and then his voice. "Evelina!" Through the roar of the fire, she heard him. Alaric. He came like a force of nature, crashing against the locked door until the wood splintered. Flames clawed at his cloak, but he did not falter. With one last savage blow, the door burst inward. The chamber was a hell of smoke and fire, but Alaric charged through it, his eyes wild with fear. He seized Evelina into his arms as though she weighed nothing. "Hold to me," he commanded, his voice hoarse. She clung to him, burying her face against his shoulder as he carried her through the inferno. His breath was ragged, his stride relentless, each step a battle against the collapsing corridors. The flames roared, beams cracked, smoke choked the air, but Alaric pressed on, his arms like iron, his will unbreakable. At last, they burst into the open courtyard. Rain poured down, hissing as it met the fire. Servants rushed with buckets, shouting, fighting to contain the blaze. But Evelina saw none of it, only Alaric, as he sank to one knee, still holding her, as though he could not let go. Her face streaked with soot, her lungs aching. She pressed her lips close to his. "I will not leave you, Alaric," she whispered through the smoke. "Not now, not ever." His eyes met hers then, grey and storm-tossed, but alive with something fierce. Not despair, not ruin, but hope. Around them, the west wing burned. Blackthorn's shadows shrieked in flame. Yet in the center of it all, amidst betrayal and destruction, a vow was forged, and Evelina knew, whatever came, their fates were bound together now, forever. Chapter 7. Ashes and Vows. The storm had spent itself at last. By dawn, the flames had been quenched. The west wing of Blackthorn Castle lay in ruin, its once proud walls charred, its windows shattered, its tapestries reduced to ash. Smoke still curled from the wreckage, rising into the pale morning sky like the last sighs of a dying beast. Yet the heart of the fortress endured. Exhausted servants slumped in the courtyard, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Buckets lay toppled, their contents spilled. The chapel bell rang faintly, tolling not for death, but for survival. Blackthorn, scarred but standing, had weathered yet another storm, and at its center stood Alaric. His cloak was torn, his hands blackened from fire, a streak of soot marking his scarred brow. But his stance was unbroken, his eyes fixed upon Evelina as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. She too was stained with ash, her hair tangled, her gown ruined, yet she had never felt more alive. Every breath in her lungs was proof of what they had endured. Every beat of her heart sang the truth she could no longer deny. Alaric strode to her, his voice rough, almost breaking. "You should not have been there," he said, his hands, still trembling from battle and fire, reached toward her but stopped short as though afraid she might vanish if touched. "You could have died, and yet I live," Evelina whispered, her gaze steady. "Because you came for me, because you chose me." The courtyard stilled. The servants, though weary, watched their lord as though witnessing something greater than survival, a reckoning of spirit. Alaric's hand lifted at last, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that belied its roughness. His thumb traced a streak of soot, as though wiping away all that had tried to claim her. "I swore once never to love again," he said, his voice raw. "I swore it over the ashes of what I lost, convincing myself that solitude was strength. But you," he faltered, his grey eyes burning with a storm fiercer than any thunder, "you have shattered every oath. You have defied every wall I built. You have given me reason to live." Evelina's breath caught, her heart, long starved of kindness, swelled with a joy so fierce it hurt. "Then live," she said, her voice breaking with tears. "Live with me, not in shadows, not in sorrow, but in whatever future we can build together. Let us write it day by day, in light instead of grief." For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the drip of rainwater from the battlements, the crackle of dying embers. Then Alaric bent his head and kissed her. It was not the kiss of a man testing fate, but of one who had chosen it, fierce, unyielding, filled with the heat of fire and the salt of tears. Evelina clung to him, her hands gripping his shoulders as though anchoring herself to the only truth she had ever known. When they parted, breathless, the world seemed new. The dowager, defeated, had fled before dawn, her carriage vanishing down the cliff road, her schemes undone, her venom spent. Rumors of her treachery would follow, tarnishing her name, but she would hold no sway over Evelina again. And Evelina, once cast out into storm and darkness, now stood not as a beggar at a gate, but as a woman who had claimed her place by love's fire. Later that morning, as the castle steadied from chaos, Rowan approached them in the courtyard. His clothes were singed, his face lined with exhaustion, yet his eyes held something Evelina had not seen before, quiet hope. "My lord," Rowan said, bowing low, "the damage is grave, but the heart of Blackthorn remains. With time, it can be restored." Alaric's gaze lingered on Evelina before he answered, "Then we shall rebuild, not for the ghosts of what was, but for the life that begins anew." Rowan's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "As you say, my lord, as you say." That night, after the ruins had been tended, Alaric led Evelina to the chapel that clung to the cliff's edge. Its stained glass windows were cracked, its pews worn, but a hush of reverence lingered there, as though storms and flames had no dominion over it. They stood before the altar, the sky beyond the broken glass streaked with the colors of a storm-cleansed sunset, amber and rose fading into twilight. Alaric took her hands in his voice steady though soft. "I do not ask for vows bound by priest or paper," he said, only the vow of truth. Will you stand with me, Evelina, not as prisoner or ward, but as equal? Will you walk beside me through ruin and through dawn? Tears shimmered in her eyes, though her smile was radiant. Yes, Alaric, I vow myself to you, not for title, nor for protection, but for love. Whatever storms may come, I will not leave your side. They sealed their vow with a kiss beneath the cracked glass, as the sea thundered below like applause to their defiance. From that day, Blackthorn began to change. The servants, once silent shadows, found laughter again in the kitchens. Rowan took charge of the rebuilding, his voice carrying commands with renewed vigor. Ivy was trimmed back, gardens reclaimed, windows mended. The scars of fire would always remain, but they no longer spoke of ruin, they spoke of survival. And at the heart of it all were Evelina and Alaric. He walked no longer with bowed head, but with steady stride, his scar not a mark of shame, but of endurance. She moved through the halls, not as a guest uncertain of her place, but as mistress of the house, her voice bringing warmth where once there had been only silence. At night, when the storms rolled across the sea, they no longer sat apart in shadows. They sat together side by side, firelight on their faces, their hands entwined, for the lonely lord was lonely no more, and the cast-out lady had found her home at last.